Thank you, Alexa. My name is Liz Salerno, and I focus on the gains and losses of General Motors ignition switch recall. So, first let's address how did the public respond in the scenario with the cover-up of the ignition switch recall. As I work for a GM dealership in Naperville, I was able to be hands-on with this experience and the customer's reaction to how they responded to the recall. First, they obviously reacted negatively, they were outraged, they were in a panic, and they demanded answers from the dealerships and through General Motors. This was an issue for the GM dealerships because even though I worked for a GM dealership, General Motors as a whole company was not providing actual documentation or information to the GM dealerships about anything in regards to the recall right away. And this caused a massive amount of rage and angerness from the public because of them not giving document information to us that could be related to the public. So this led to people demanding their cars to be into service right away, that they're not driving their vehicles, and demanding courtesy vehicles for free, and basically it just all reacted in a horrible way where it was a 4-month process over the whole summer when the recall was first initially announced. So we first want to talk about then after that is the old GM. As stated, there's a new GM model and there's an old GM model, and the old GM model displayed poor leadership. This is how the whole cover-up for the ignition switch recall first initially started and how things were covered up by specific employees. When GM would go into meetings first discussing the ignition switch issue and the recall process, representatives were told that they would just nod, where company officials would attend a meeting, not in agreement, and then no course of action was taken or changed to do the requirements that needed to be done. This is a very poor effort in leadership skills, and leadership is the ability to make strategic decisions and use communication effectively to mobilize group members towards achieving a common goal. And the old GM demonstrated this in a poor way by not taking course of action right away into the ignition switch recall issue. So, who did this affect? What people were affected, and who was going to get fired? Outlining the results of an internal probe, GM Chief Executive Mary T. Barra, who is the new GM CEO, said that 15 employees deemed responsible for not vigorously tackling the problem and have been forced out of the company, and 5 others have been disciplined, according to Michael Fletcher. The investigation by Anton R. Belkus, a former U.S. attorney, did not tie problems to top executives in the company. So, in regards to figuring out, was people doing this for the extra money? Was people doing this to receive more profits, as in the big people in the company? No. This was more of an issue that people were just covering up the actual default, and they did not want to take action in fixing the problem. No one was receiving extra money, no one was getting a bundle in their pocket. This was simply a case where certain people in the company knew about the issue and they did not want to proceed and move forward with finding out the exact issue. But as we saw, 15 employees were specifically fired. They did not describe who, but as I will state later on in the company, my presentation, it was not head representatives of General Motors. So, the effect, that culture contributed to GM's waiting more than a decade to recall 2.6 million Chevrolet Cobalts and other smaller vehicles equipped with the defective switch, which has been linked to at least 13 deaths and 54 accidents, according to Michael Fletcher. So, if this is leading into deaths and accidents, of course we are going to see that there were lawsuits and trials going on with the ignition switch recall because of General Motors not taking course of action right away 10 years ago. So, the report was released after the ignition switch problem triggered a series of government investigations and lawsuits that permitted Barra to restrict GM's top ranks to more quickly deal with safety problems. The automaker has ordered 30 recalls affecting nearly 16 million vehicles in North America. The recalls alone have cost the General Motors automaker $1.7 billion in total. And as someone who, as I stated, worked for General Motors, this is just statistics that was going on a few months ago that I was given, and recalls are coming out every other month for General Motors because of the ignition switch recall. They are being so careful now when they release new vehicles or older vehicles, or opening old special policies, which we'll learn about in one of the cases for one of the girls who was tragically killed because of this recall incident. And they're constantly opening new recalls for different vehicles because of how careful they want to be with their vehicles, and that the ignition switch recall is not an issue how it has been going on for the past year now with the recall being open. Mary has apologized repetitively and appointed a former federal prosecutor to lead an internal investigation to figure out where the process broke down. GM also has appointed a new vice president for vehicle safety, tasked with identifying and resolving safety issues, according to Michael Fletcher. So, Mary displays and demonstrates the 5M model of leadership effectiveness. Model leadership, motivate members, manage group process, make decisions, and mentor members. Mary is displaying and taking action that she knows as her new role as the CEO for General Motors, that things need to be done, people need to get fired, and what's going to happen, and who's going to be responsible for having these courses of action taken in the right direction. So, this also leads into her decision-making process, which involves making a judgment, choosing an option, and making up your mind about something. Mary knows that she is responsible for going to meetings, addressing issues, and continuing to move forward with General Motors and making sure that the right course of action will be taken. And now a short clip that I would like to go and to move forward with.
Found in this situation was a pattern of incompetence and neglect. Repeatedly, individuals failed to disclose critical pieces of information that could have fundamentally changed the lives of those impacted by the faulty ignition switch. If this information had been disclosed, and I believe this in my heart, the company would have dealt with this situation much differently and appropriately. Furthermore, numerous individuals did not take the responsibility to drive the organization to understand what was truly happening. The report highlights a company that operated in silos, with a number of individuals seemingly looking for reasons to not act instead of finding ways to protect our customers. Let me be clear, this should have never happened. It is unacceptable. There was no conspiracy by the corporation to cover up facts. In addition, the investigators found no evidence that any employee made a trade-off between safety and cost. The pattern in this case is much more complex and more nuanced. What Valukas found was a pattern of management deficiencies and misjudgments, often based on incomplete data that were passed off at the time as business as usual. Unfortunately, the report found that these seemingly benign actions led to devastating consequences. In short, we misdiagnosed the problem from the very beginning. Experienced engineers with the responsibility for safety did not understand that the airbags would not deploy if the ignition switch changed into the off position. 15 individuals who we determined to have acted inappropriately are no longer with the company. Some were removed because of what we consider misconduct or incompetence. Others have been relieved because they simply didn't do enough. They didn't take responsibility. They didn't act with a sense of urgency. Disciplinary actions have been taken also against 5 additional employees as part of the company. And with these moves, I feel we have addressed the personnel issues in this matter.
Okay, so just hearing Mary speak, another key term that I learned very well in group communications is Mary demonstrates being very assertive in that speech.
Here's what you need to know about the Greek debt crisis. Greece has a 1.5 billion euro debt repayment to make to the International Monetary Fund and a
Mary shows very strong assertiveness during her speech in front of that whole group. So, what is assertiveness? Speaking up and acting in your own best interest without denying the rights and interests of others. Mary spoke as, of course, as CEO of General Motors on behalf of the whole company, stating the facts and stating what needed to be done and who needed to be terminated in order to keep the company moving forward. So some of the assertive skills that I've also learned that she demonstrated in her presentation was preparing for the meeting, which she specifically did. She expressed her opinion clearly about the facts and the documentation, and she maintained direct eye contact when speaking about her part of the presentation. So now, someone who was a blocker, who stands in the way of progress, is someone named Raymond DiGiori. The report was especially critical of Raymond DiGiori and said that the engineer approved the initial ignition switch design in 2001, even though he knew it failed to meet GM standards. After problems surfaced, Mr. Giori tweaked the design but told no one about the change and didn't assign a new part number to the switch, which might have alerted GM to the problems, the report concluded. Moving on with the lawsuits that General Motors faced from the ignition switch recall is that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration can impose against an automaker for failing to disclose safety problems in a timely manner. So because GM was not responding to them right away, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration levied a $35 million fine against General Motors, which is the maximum amount of money that they can receive towards an automaker. GM will also be required to pay tens of thousands of dollars in additional civil penalties for not responding, as I stated, to them right away during the government's investigation, according to Michael Fletcher. So now, who has this ignition switch recall impacted? Who has this truly affected in people's lives and whose lives were lost? Brooke Milton was one of those individuals who unfortunately passed away because of her Chevrolet Cobalt when she was killed in a crash on March 10th, 2010 on her 29th birthday. Her parents decided to hire a professional engineer to figure out that her daughter was not at fault with the Cobalt and wanted further investigation done. So the engineer did find a problem with the car's ignition switch, and the Meltons took General Motors to court and settled for $5 million in 2013. But as GM released the recall in 2014, the automaker admitted knowing the ignition switch flaw, the parents decided to not agree with their first settlement and asked the judge to reopen their case because of General Motors stating that the ignition switch recall in 2014, and then further investigation was found that the parents of the Meltons, did receive a bigger lump of money, but that information was not disclosed from the lawyers. Another individual who suffered a tragic loss was Laura Christian. Laura Christian, she had a daughter who was killed with her airbag when her airbag did not deploy, and she is also trying to sue General Motors, according to Michael Fletcher. Originally, a service bulletin was issued in 2005 saying that, quote, a heavy key ring or jarrings can turn the ignition off, which disables the airbags. And then the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had access to that, but no recalls were ordered, according to Jeff Glore. So, we'll previously watch another video from Laura Christian, who wanted to speak up about her daughter's death and how she felt towards General Motors.
Laura Christian is planning to sue General Motors for the wrongful death of her 15-year-old daughter, Amber. The airbags in her Chevy Cobalt failed to deploy in a crash because of a critical defect. It was not until 7 years later that GM issued a recall.
When I first started contacting GM in September of 2005, I was trying to find out, what happened, what made these airbags not deploy, and how many other folks did this happen to, and even more importantly, what they were planning on doing to fix it. But unfortunately, nobody would ever speak to me there. I'm actually very sorry that it came to that. I contacted GM again a month ago. I simply wanted them to give my contact information to the other families, the other victims' families, to hope to get us all together and maybe heal a little bit. But they pretty much have refused to do that. Apparently the only thing they listen to are things that affect their bottom line.
About a month ago, Christian created a GM Survivors page on Facebook to connect with other families.
It's just a shame that corporations, big corporations like GM, feel that they might be large enough to hide the truth from the public. But in this day and age, there are many people like me who will seek to uncover that information. There is no more hiding.
GM CEO Mary Barra did speak out this week, posting videos aimed at consumers on the firm's YouTube page. She will answer more questions when she appears at a U.S. Senate panel hearing. Christian will be there.
I'm hoping to speak to the CEO, Mary Barra, at least just for a few minutes, to find out what she's found out so far and what they're planning on doing to uncover all of this information that's been hidden for so many years.
Okay, so again, Laura Christian and her daughter were dramatically affected because of the ignition switch recall with General Motors, and it wasn't just the ignition switch, but as we stated in this, that it's the airbags that didn't deploy because of the recall defect. So, of course, we've seen a lot of losses, a lot of people who actually have lost their lives because of the ignition switch recall. And then,
here's what you need to know about the Greek debt crisis. Greece has a 1.5 billion euro debt repayment to make to the International Monetary Fund and a 4.2 billion euro payment to the European Central Bank, or the ECB. If a deal for more funding...
Sorry about that. Okay, so there are also, though, General Motors hasn't just suffered losses. They also have bounced back and gained a lot of respect from consumers. Sales are stronger than ever for General Motors. They have a bright future ahead of them with the remodeling of their vehicles and the sales increasing, as I stated. As May of 2015 was their best-selling month in over 6 years. So the designing and creation of, as we quoted earlier in the presentation, the new General Motors is definitely advancing and bringing back a lot of attention in a positive direction towards GM consumers. And according, Daniel G. Hill, President Irvin Hill Strategy, from a crisis management firm, quoted, "Part of their effort is to convince consumers that the new GM is not the old GM." So, as I continue to say, this is where GM and their dealerships need to inform their customers that service will always be on top of things. There always is access to finding out if there's open recalls, if there's service bulletins, what we can do to help these consumers and feel safe in their vehicles. And here's a little chart that I found from GM February retail sales up 70% compared to February 2010. So cars are up 76%, trucks are up 74%, and crossovers are up 59%. This is just a positive and right direction that General Motors is taking to have their consumers proceed and move forward and to respect them again. And now here is Mackenzie finishing off the project.